Dr. Gallagher has asked me to talk about the role of apologetics in the American Restoration movement. And as I think about apologetics, it's first important to remember that apologetics, just like literature, history, art, has the fingerprints of its times. So we wouldn't expect, for instance, for apologetics over a 150-year period to be consistent and uniform. The best example I can think of that is The Crucible by Arthur Miller. Is the play about the Salem witch trials? Yes and no. Yes, because Miller was fascinated by those events ever since he was a student at the University of Michigan. But no, in the sense that the principal reason he wrote the play in 1952 was not to write a play about the Salem witch trials. In fact, Miller acknowledged that himself. He said it was the maturation of the hysteria at the time which pulled the trigger. Without the latter, I would never have launched. And what he's referring to was the McCarthyite witch hunts of the House Un-American Activities Committee and such. And so he saw the play as an allegory of his time. And so if we read The Crucible as simply a play about the Salem witch trials, then we miss a lot about the play because it has the fingerprints of Miller's own time on it. And the same thing is true about apologetics. If we were to look at apologetics in the American Restoration movement after the reemergence of fundamentalism in the mid-20th century, we would expect it to be quite different than maybe apologetics that's taking place today in a postmodern context, and we would expect both of those to be different than apologetics in a pre-Darwinian era. And we see that. J.W. McGarvey's approach in Evidences for Christianity is quite different than Campbell's approach, Alexander Campbell's approach, some 50 years earlier. And so what you have happening is you have changes in how people approach things, changes in philosophy. And so between Campbell and McGarvey, preachers became more interested in presenting the idea of the restoration plea to those who had already accepted the basic concepts of Christianity. And so you have really kind of no big apologetics going on between Campbell and McGarvey. But what you have when McGarvey emerges is the breakdown of the confidence in Scripture with the popular recognition of the historical, critical method of studying the Bible in the United States following the Civil War. And so you have a situation where even non-believers had long granted to Christianity the witness of history. Also you have the development of the idea of the progressive improvement based on Darwinian organic evolution. You have the rise of Romanticism with the emphasis on individual feeling and intuition and experience rather than reason. You have people questioning the integrity of New Testament books, their genuineness, their authenticity, their inspiration. And so between that time of Campbell and McGarvey, you expect changes, and that's what you see. And so McGarvey deals with genuineness, deals with authenticity, deals with inspiration that Campbell might not have needed to deal with because of the differences in their time. And so time's not going to allow me to talk about, obviously, apologetics through the whole scope of the American Restoration movement to today. So what I would like to do in thinking about that, the idea that apologetics bears the fingerprints of its time, bears the stamp of its time on it, is to really start at the beginning and think about apologetic philosophy at the beginning of the American Restoration movement. And obviously you have to start with Alexander Campbell. And I would particularly like to focus on his debate with Robert Owen that took place in 1829. This is a sketch of Robert Owen, I think around 1823, about 6 years or so before the debate. Owen was born in 1771 and died in 1858. Owen was a British industrial leader and turned to be a social reformer later in his life. He began his career as a manager of the cotton mills in New Lanark, Scotland, and eventually helped push factory reform legislation through Parliament. He was a believer in what's called environmental determinism, the idea that at birth humans are born as a tabula rasa or a blank slate, and they are just simply waiting to be molded either positively or negatively. Owen had, there were two major aspects of Owen's legacy, especially in Britain. There was the scientific management of modern industrial factories, of which he was a leader. But he's also known primarily today as the father of British socialism. And he's influenced, has lasted into the 21st century in the United Kingdom with the emergence of the Labour Party in 1900, its 20th century achievements culminating in the National Health Service, the principle of equality of opportunity, and ultimately the establishment of the United Kingdom as a modern welfare state. Friedrich Engels, a disciple of Owen's and later a partner, Karl Marx, said of Owen that every social movement, every real advance in England on behalf of the workers links itself to the man Robert Owen. Owen came to the United States in 1824 seeking broader social reform through poverty relief, education, and communal living. He came to New Harmony, Indiana, established a community based on the rejection of private property, religion, and marriage. On July 4th, in 1826, he made a speech which he called the Declaration of Mental Independence. And he basically set forth that private property, marriage, and religion are, as he called it, the trinity of the most monstrous evils that could be combined to inflict mental and physical evil upon the whole race. Alexander Campbell responded to Owen's assertions in the April 2nd, 1827 issue of his Christian Baptist. He said about mental independence, "Out of his mental independence has arisen the hostility to the Bible, free agency, responsibility, marriage, and every religious institute are exiled from the city of mental independence." And so what you have happening is you have two things going on. You have kind of the waning of the idea of skepticism in the United States with the reemergence of the Second Great Awakening. And so in a sense, Owen's losing his reputation in the United States and Britain as he is promoting the ideas of being against private property, marriage, and religion. But at the same time, very quickly, you have kind of a re-emergence in response to the Second Great Awakening in skepticism. And so you have Campbell really with popular sentiment behind him, but at the same time, the need to engage these skeptics. And so Campbell did that. He did engage skepticism. He began doing that through the pages of the Christian Baptist beginning in 1826. Let me pull back a little bit before we get too far ahead of ourselves. In the Christian Baptist in 1826, a young man that was identified simply by the initial D wrote a letter in which he kind of indicated deist philosophy, the rejection of the Bible as a revelation from God, and he was asking Campbell about this. He wanted him to respond. He wanted him to give him some kind of assurances. And the problem that D had was the idea of eternal torment, the idea that God would punish anybody eternally for temporal sins in this life. The idea that free will to him seemed to be a curse because you have the opportunity to choose, then you basically are consigned to eternal damnation for simply not believing in something maybe that happened thousands of years ago. And in his mind, his God could not do those things. And so Alexander Campbell wrote 6 essays in response, and he noted first the importance of revelation. He said to D that the 5 senses don't tell him what he is assuming to be true. And that is that there is a self-existent, independent, eternal God, that the world was created by Him, that we all have within us an immortal spirit, that there will be an end or termination of this world's state of things, and there will be a future state of rewards if you're not willing to acknowledge punishments. At least he was willing to acknowledge rewards. And so Campbell said, you can't know any of those things except by some special revelation from God. You can't get those from your 5 senses. And so he told D, he said, you're accepting revelation from God while rejecting it, basically. He also talked about the existence of evil. He said, basically, your objection to the existence of evil is purely theoretical because you don't know what God would or wouldn't do in this matter. He also said that if you don't have evil, then you can't have God as your governor, meaning you have to have free choice to choose to obey God or not, or God cannot be your governor at all. And he also talked about how that if God had created us with no choice, then we would simply be in motion with the inability to actually choose and decide to follow God. He used kind of, in his day, the illustration that we use, talking about maybe that if God created us with no free choice, we would be kind of like robots. Of course, he's not going to use the illustration of robots. He uses the illustration of the mill wheel, that basically it's in motion with no choice of its own. And so Campbell began responding to those that were questioning, especially that the Bible was the revelation of God. As Campbell begins to write about these things, it's very clear that he is aware of the writings of those with whom he might agree philosophically, and he's aware of the writings of those he might disagree with philosophically. Specifically thinking about the writings of Spinoza or Hobbes or Voltaire or Rousseau. And so he's very well read and he's ready to engage skeptics in these discussions. And so he talks about in these discussions and eventually in this debate with Robert Owen about the principles of investigation on which the inductive philosophy of Lord Bacon is founded, and those adopted by the Christian philosopher Sir Isaac Newton are those which should govern us on this occasion. And so in his writings and then ultimately in the debate, Campbell thought that the philosophy of Bacon, the philosophy of Newton, and Locke should govern him and others in these discussions. And so as you think about Bacon, you think about Lord Bacon, Francis Bacon, he would have argued that revelation is the basis of our faith, some kind of revelation from God, but also that you study Scripture the way you study nature, and so you study it scientifically. He would not have, Bacon wouldn't have, and Campbell wouldn't have either, have emphasized the book of nature idea like Newton and Locke did, that we can study the book of nature and find out things about God just as well as we can study the book of Scripture and find out things about God. But they would have still had the same kind of philosophy about how to ascertain truth. Number one, there are no innate ideas. You are furnished with faculties in which you can discover all you need to know. You can discover truth. God has given you that ability. And when you compile this evidence and come up with truth, it's equal to mathematical certainty. In other words, just like 2 + 2 is 4, you can study philosophy, you can study the Scriptures, and you can come to a scientific conclusion about these ideas. And so that is influence from Bacon and Newton and Locke and others. And so when he talks about studying these things, Campbell said, when we enter into an examination of the testimony on which religion is predicated, we have no other scientific rules to resort to than those which regulate and govern us in ascertaining the weight of all historical evidence. And so he says you study Scripture like you do science. It has a set of scientific rules, and that's how you ascertain truth based on the evidence. Owen had challenged clergy to debate him, and especially his 12 points about human nature that he liked to talk about. And Campbell responded to it, offered to debate Owen within a year in a place equidistant to New Harmony, Indiana, and Bethany. And so that debate took place in Cincinnati, and it began on Monday, April 13th, 1829, and it lasted 5 days. The British author Francis Trollope described, oh, by the way, let's talk about this picture just for a second. Obviously you have everybody, or the 3 main folks labeled, so that helps us. You've got Robert Owen who's standing, got Alexander Campbell here to his left. This ghostly figure up in the pulpit is Alexander's father, Thomas. I actually tried to find an old sketch of Thomas to see if that was an accurate image of him, and it actually pretty much is. That's what it looks like later in life. But here you have the debate, or the sketch of the debate, by Auguste Jean And so the debate took place and was described by Trollope as a spectacle unprecedented in any age or country. Another witness described it as combat unparalleled in the annals of disputation. And so it was considered a big event in Cincinnati in 1829. Now what Owen did was, here's his basic approach, but what Owen did was he outlined reasons for believing in environmental determinism, and so he emphasized the 12 fundamental laws of human nature that he said were violated by the religions of the world. This is the 6th one, and this is the only one that Campbell in the debate said he objected to. He said he accepted all 12 except for this one, that each individual is so created that he must believe according to the strongest impressions that are made on his feelings and other faculties, while his belief in no case depends upon his will. And so basically the idea is you're born, you have influences placed upon you, and you have no real choice. Campbell's approach to Owen was, he said, if that's true, then how did you escape what you were given? And so he talked about Owen's own religious upbringing and asked how he escaped that if our environmental determinism were true. And so what Campbell argued was the value and defensibility of Christianity. He used a modified classical ontological argument for God's existence, the idea that it's impossible to have any idea without having some kind of archetype in nature. And so he said about that, we have an idea of God, of a creator, a being who has produced the whole material universe by the bare exhibition of physical creative power. This idea, we contend, can have no archetype in nature because we have never seen anything produced out of nothing. But we have the idea of the existence of this creative power. And so he says, we have this idea of God, but we can't see it in nature because this idea does not exist in nature. And so he's arguing for a special revelation from God rather than revelation through nature. He goes on to say, it is to be found in almost all religions. If we appeal to traditionary or historic evidence, we will find that all nations had originally some ideas of the existence of a great first cause. But the difficulty is, how did the idea originate? By what process could it have been engendered? Where was the archetype in nature to suggest the remotest idea of a creator or any other idea concerning spiritual things? And so he said, if you want to know about spiritual things, if you want to know about God, it's not good enough simply to look at creation, but you have to look at the special revelation from God, and he obviously claimed that that special revelation was the Bible. As to environmental determinism, Campbell again asked Owen, how did you escape your own upbringing in your own environment? And so this emphasized again the power of God's revelation as opposed to the deist approach and looking at the God of nature. Campbell argued there was no stopping point between atheism and Christianity. You couldn't have a deistic God that created all things, that is evidence in nature, but did not have any kind of special relationship with humanity. He said that you were either an atheist or a Christian. There was no stopping point between the two. And he also contended that Christian benevolence was what prompted Owen to invent a plan of education and care for the children of the poor in Great Britain and the United States. And interestingly enough, Owen conceded this, but said it doesn't mean that Christianity is true. Now, there was one thing that they did agree about, and that was millennial optimism. Owen believed that his social plan was the final component necessary for secular millennialism, that religion was the last obstacle to a society of kindness, intelligence, sincerity, and prosperity. Alexander Campbell had a similar view towards societal advancements. He believed that humanity was progressively moving toward a golden age, but he claimed that that would be through an understanding of the pure Christian religion. Now, during this debate, Campbell got frustrated because Owen simply kept repeating these 12 fundamental laws of human nature over and over again. And so he got Owen to agree to allow him to speak uninterrupted until he felt like that he had made his point, that Campbell had made his point. And this was called a historic speech. this historic speech of the century, not only in duration, but in illumination and constructive power of solid and brilliant argumentation. So you can see there's superlatives seem to be endless in regard to this debate and the work that Campbell was doing. But historic speech, it was a 12-hour discourse delivered over 3 days in 2-hour speeches. He would speak from 10 a.m. to noon and then 2 to 4. And he talked about the historical evidence of the Christian religion. He talked about the prophetic evidences of Christianity. He talked about the arguments of the genius and tendency of the Christian faith. And he talked about the faults of the Owen social system. And believe it or not, when he got done, Owen complimented him. He said, "The friends of truth, therefore, on whichever side the question it may be found, are now more indebted to Mr. Campbell than any other Christian minister of the present day." In fact, Campbell came to believe that Owen might get up at the end of the debate and say, "I now believe in Christianity and I was wrong." But Owen didn't do that. But they did kind of develop a friendship that would last into their later lives. Now, the importance of this debate is recognized by those who study these things more deeply than I. And Richard Schrock wrote in his book, Debating for God, that this debate influenced Campbell for the rest of his life and his career. Campbell developed an international reputation as a prominent Christian leader, defender of the Christian faith. This helped him formalize his arguments against skepticism. And he maintained the value of this debate and its defense of Christianity throughout his life. Probably nearly 25 years later, he began to work on a reprint of the debate. By the way, Owen sold his rights to the printing of the debate to Campbell. And so Campbell printed this debate, and he's reprinting it, and he's thinking about it, and goes back and reads it again, and this is what he says. He says, "I must say that I am better pleased with it than I expected to be. It is yet as necessary to be read by skeptics of all schools, free thinkers, slave thinkers, and no thinkers, and perhaps by weak Christians and certain other persons who cannot be named," which I'm not sure who that is, "as it was when pronounced and first printed." And so he felt like he had done his job, and he felt like even a generation later that it was still significant. He continued to confront advocates of free thought and challenged them to debates, and so he said, "I have invited any gentleman who may be in possession of any historic, philosophic, or logical objection to my argument to adduce it either orally or in writing." And so kind of to sum up, I think it's important to recognize that, that these things don't happen in a vacuum. The idea that Campbell felt the confidence and the need to challenge skeptics indicates what was going on at the time. Number one, you have the influence of the Second Great Awakening. You have the reemergence of skepticism in response to it. And so Campbell felt confident that truth and general consensus was on his side, but at the same time he felt the need to challenge a kind of a rising skepticism, and a good target for that was Owen. But it's also important to understand that that apologetics change over time to meet the demands of society, and so what you might expect from Campbell again is not what you would expect if you're going to read McGarvey's Christian Evidences, in which he deals with issues more related to the integrity of the Bible, which generally would not have been, as challenged during Campbell's day. And I would expect that we could look back later at our time and understand why apologetics is the way it is today. The emphasis on intelligent design and things like that probably would not have been as important in Campbell's day, and I guess maybe in a sense not in McGarvey's day, as they are for us today. It's important to recognize those fingerprints, not only in the past, but start to try to recognize them in ourselves. Why do we do history the way that we do it today? Why do we do art and literature the way that we do it today? And why do we do apologetics the way that we do it today? And hopefully that will help us, if we understand ourselves better, I think that will help us understand the nature of these arguments better, those that are on sound footing, and maybe those that are on not so sound footing. I've got a few minutes, 2 minutes, if anybody has a question that I would like for Wayne to answer, then you can ask a question, but or a comment.
I've got a comment. I don't know why most people, when they look at the Campbell-Owen debate, they never give Owen's background on this. Robert Owen, I've got a copy of his journal that was printed shortly after he died, and it was edited by a close friend of his. And Owen issued a challenge to all ministers in America. And this challenge was issued for quite a while before Campbell ever responded to it. I think Campbell was waiting for somebody else to do it, and he finally decided nobody's going to do it. Somebody's got to take this guy on. But what's interesting about that is after the debate happened, Robert Owen never does mention that debate after it's over. He made the boast that when he finished, that America would know once and for all there was no God. There was no need for religion. But he never addresses that after the debate. And so the editor of that book, his journal, finally felt compelled to say something about the debate. And they said, well, it was considered a draw. But see, Owen, what I find interesting about it, Owen, I think he felt he was whipped.
Yeah.
Is the reason he never did say any more about it.
Yeah. In fact, he and Campbell met in New York late in Owen's life, and Campbell said of that meeting that Owen never brought up the debate in the conversation one time. And your reference to the idea of Campbell not wanting to debate Owen or kind of waiting for somebody else to do it, I think goes back to his father's view of debating. Thomas Campbell did not believe that debate and disputing publicly like that was the appropriate way to discuss religion and religious differences. And I think basically Alexander was, in deference to his father, really didn't want to get into debates and disputes publicly like that until he felt like he absolutely had to. And then once he did it, though, I mean, the public response was overwhelming, and he felt like,
well, his first two debates, he was basically, his arms were twisted. The Walker-Campbell debate, and then the 1823 debate with McCullough. Campbell really didn't volunteer willingly.
Yeah, and I think with the Walker debate, he even went to Thomas and basically asked his permission. Yeah. To do it.
But Barton Stone, Brother Stone is overlooked, and I'm not saying you did this because you have to go back and study a lot about Stone. But Stone actually had a little short debate with a deist in Gallatin, Tennessee while he was preaching. And there Stone makes it clear that that the deist wouldn't have known half of what he was saying if it hadn't have been, he said, you stole it from my Bible.
Yeah, that's the same argument Campbell made. Right here.
In order to say I am not, you gotta have I am.
Do what now?
In order to say I am not, you gotta have I am.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true. Yeah. All right, good point. Jeremy?
I don't know anything about any of these people, so excuse my ignorance on this. One thing I can't help but thinking is, I just don't understand. I keep wondering if, like you were talking about Robert Owen and the reputation he had. Now Alexander Campbell has a reputation for us, but I couldn't help but wondering at the whole time. This is my question: was this like what if Churches of Christ picked their best representatives to debate Carl Sagan? Now, obviously, everybody knows who Carl Sagan is, but nobody knows who our representative would be. And until the debate had taken place, and even then, most people wouldn't know who our person it was. So what I kept wondering was, did Robert Owen not ever respond afterwards and also sell the rights to it? Is it possible not because he lost the debate, but because he didn't care enough about it to do anything about it? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, I think he cared because his son shortly after that debate, became a believer. Robert Owens Jr., Robert Dale Owens. He became a
The
believer.
question really indirectly is, was Alexander Campbell a man of reputation?
Yeah. By then, he already was.
I mean, not us, but
He was known all over the eastern part of the United States. He'd spoken by that time before state assemblies, and somewhere along in there he speaks before Congress, and I can't remember what year that was.
Yeah, but I think Jeremy's got a good point in that. I think it's this Owen
it is a question.
debate is
I don't
what,
know.
or it's worthy discussing is this debate what really launches his reputation?
Well, no,
'Cause
I don't think so.
You got
Because
thousands of
Owen
people
in this
attending.
country wasn't very well known either.
It's true.
You've got to consider that. The New Harmony thing outside of Indiana, the average person in Alabama or Tennessee didn't know who Robert Owen was.
Yeah, but in the East, if something was going on in Europe and you were a leader in the East, you knew about what was going on over there. They were looking back and they knew where we were going. We're out of time, by the way, so if you need to leave, go ahead. I'll sit here.
I think we missed the point in that it wasn't about Alexander Campbell, it was about what he was trying to bring forward. And so his message did reach the masses in a time where it was impossible to reach the masses. And so maybe that was what we need to get out of the debate more than who debated who. It was the message that came across. How many times would you get an opportunity to speak for 2 hours to non-believers in that type of environment and then speak again after lunch for 2 more hours and have a ready audience willing to listen?
It's like Floyd Wallace, that here, from what I hear, they would preach 3 hours or something.
And that point about Owen conceding the rest of the time, I know Haley sort of makes that sound like that Campbell more or less requested that time, but Owen was ready to wind it up.
Okay.
I mean, he was ready. If you go back, I don't know where Haley got all of his information. I'm quite familiar with J.J. Haley's book on the Restoration Movement, but he makes it sound like that Campbell sort of asked permission. But other sources makes it sound like Owens just basically, after 3 days of covering the same thing over and over and over, that he said all he was going to say.
Yeah, it might be a little bit of both. Might be a little bit of both. All right, well, let's go ahead and stop there. Let's have prayer as we dismiss. God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity we have to discuss those that have sought truth and discussed these things through the years. We pray that this will help us as we continue to search and know your truth. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for the opportunity to study it and to know it and to apply it and try to live it out in our lives. We thank you especially for Jesus, and we offer this prayer in his name. Amen.